We now come to what has been billed on the RAI's agenda card, a programme card, as the President's Lecture. And perhaps before I get into the main part of the topic, I should recall that a few years ago, while I was on council in my capacity as a vice president, but before there was any suggestion that I might become a president, there was a brief discussion in council about the President's Lecture. And some of us, maybe including me, wondered why the membership of the Institute should be subjected to a lecture by the President, not just once, but 3 times, bearing in mind that we have 8 lecture slots in our winter season from October to May. Why should the President take up 1 of 8 when there's plenty of very good archaeology being done by non-presidents in this country? There was a certain discussion which suggested that it might be a good idea for the President to give a lecture on his or her first year, by which time he or she had only been President for a year anyway, so most of the members might know who he or she was. There was another view that it might be quite a good idea for the President to give a lecture at the end of his or her 3rd year, by which time the membership could say goodbye. There was very little reason as to why the President should give a lecture in the middle of them for a 2nd year, nor 3 years altogether. The discussion was, needless to say, totally inconclusive, and in the end, inertia prevailed. Shortly after I became President, the Secretary was demanding urgently a title for my presidential lecture. I had not at that point thought up sufficient reasons for cancelling what is allegedly a long tradition. So I'm here. You're stuck with me, at least for this year. If I return, there may be some reflections on the role of the President, tentatively entitled something like The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, a brief review of presidents and their achievements, in most cases very brief. But we'll see. So as I say, I'm here, and what I would like to talk about today is a topic rising really from some of my own specialist work in later British prehistory, especially in southern Britain. The limitation to southern Britain is partly because it's an area I think I know most about. I know remarkably little about northern Britain, Wales, Scotland and Highland areas. This is not an attempt really to reinvent Cyril Fox's idea of Highland and Lowland zones as culturally very different. It's simply a reflection of my comparative ignorance of areas outside the southeast. So I will be talking primarily about the lowlands of southern and eastern England. And of course my title is an invocation of one of the classic books of British archaeology, medieval history and landscape archaeology and landscape history, The Making of the English Landscape by Hoskins, a book I think I first read somewhere in the late 1960s or 1970, and I remember very clearly some of my reactions to reading it. Those of you familiar with the book will no doubt remember it's famous for several things, partly for being one of the pioneering books in the development of the academic disciplines of landscape history. But as a book, it's also particularly famous for the last chapter with one of the most prolonged whinges of anti-modernism, where he complains bitterly about the desecration of the English countryside by aeroplanes and diesel fuel and other such unutterable things. A very famous passage which written in 1955 actually sounds much more like 1925 or 1930, and much more like dedicated anti-modernists like Harold Massinger rather than an academic historian. But that was my first reaction, the almost snobbish reaction to modernism defiling the countryside. Second reaction was to recognise it as an important book in the development of landscape history. And a third reaction, which I gather is being shared by many people, especially prehistorians, is why on earth didn't he know more about prehistory? In fact, he writes, the prehistoric contribution considered as an influence on the whole landscape is of little importance. And to me, as a prehistorian, that sounded incomprehensible. Until a bit later, I began to reflect on my own reactions to it and did a little bit more thinking, a little bit more research, and I realised that the book was published in 1955. I was reading it perhaps 15 years later, by which time archaeology had changed considerably. The book went through, or has gone through, more than 30 different editions, but largely these are changes of front cover, changes of illustrations, an addition of a book list of recommended readings, no substantial updating of the text, as we'll see in a moment. The text is still substantially as written in 1955, with the exception of a new preface added for the 1977 edition and contained in all subsequent editions, where he does comment on his own previous work, but then at that point, more than 20 years out of date. Now, more recently, Hoskins' work has attracted attention from a lot of writers, considering his importance academically and theoretically. And let's treat one of these is by my former colleague in Southampton, Matthew Johnson, in another important book on landscape. So let's treat him to the same presentation, portrait and front cover, as we gave to Hoskins. Matthew's book, Ideas of Landscape, has got two very rather sympathetic chapters discussing Hoskins, not necessarily uncritical, but sympathetic. But he asks, why did Hoskins not recognise these landscape features? And here he's talking specifically about the prehistoric features of Devon, the Dartmoor Reeves specifically, which might have led him to take more seriously evidence of widespread prehistoric occupation of the landscape. And then he answers it, he was just not particularly interested, because the evidence was from a prehistoric, pre-literate period, and therefore incapable of being slotted into Hoskins' historical and document-based narrative. Now, Matthew goes on to relate that to Hoskins' underlying romanticism in his approach to the landscape, his inspiration from Wordsworth, also into his view of the personal engagement with the landscape, and also the metaphor of reading a landscape. If the landscape was a text, how could it be written by a pre-literate person? So Matthew's got a number of serious theoretical explanations as to why Hoskins just wasn't interested. I think it may be rather more than that. Partly it is, I think, this notion of history and the written record as the dominant form of understanding the past. Hoskins knew archaeology, he quotes widely from one of the greatest archaeologists, O.G.S. Crawford, but he's not quite as outspoken as some. There are contemporaries of Hoskins who are very, very snooty about the relationship of archaeology to history, and saying archaeology would always be a subsidiary discipline, or to put it more crudely, as one of them wrote, archaeology was a very expensive way of telling us what we already know. Hoskins is much more sympathetic, but it's also partly the prevailing attitude among many people that England was an Anglo-Saxon country. Things started with the Anglo-Saxon period, and what happened earlier was totally irrelevant and just simply insignificant. But there's also a question about what archaeology could have told him. What, if he was seriously interested in the archaeological contribution to British landscape in 1955, what archaeology could have told you? We'll come to that in a moment. There's also a question of what Hoskins was trying to do. Hoskins' purpose, he explains, he wants to explain the landscape of England as it appears today and to explain how it came to assume its present form. That sounds much more like what we would nowadays call landscape characterization, the recognition of differences in the landscape which are due to historically definable processes, which you can then characterize because they're visible today. In the revised preface, he's much clearer about this. I've striven to analyze what can be seen on the surface. Although what he presents in the book is a chronological account from the Anglo-Saxon period onwards, it's not really a history of the landscape. It's an identification of the bits of the landscape which are where the form is identifiable and traceable to particular historic processes, which he then lists in chronological order. So he's not really writing a history of the landscape in the sense that some of us might understand it. But to go back to the theme of archaeology, agriculture from Neolithic times onwards had left little mark on the landscape, other than a few more or less impressive isolated features. By that he presumably means isolated features like Stonehenge or Avebury, or maybe Maiden Castle. Yes, they're impressive, but to him they are just isolated landmarks. There's no concept of a prehistoric landscape. The vision of prehistory is a few isolated sites, Stonehenge, Avebury, Maiden Castle, Little Woodbury, existing in almost total isolation. And slightly later he writes about, one would have expected the back of the task. The task is the clearing of the woodland. The back of the task had been broken after all this Iron Age and Roman activity, whereas in fact the Anglo-Saxons moved into a country that was still generally a wilderness, with almost everything yet to be done. And later on he goes on to talk about Anglo-Saxon pioneers. There's a very clear message here about who were the real Englishmen, who shaped the real English landscape. And it wasn't pre-Roman. There's a wonderful passage where he tries to estimate the effect of Roman cultivation on Britain. He adopts a methodology, but actually since then it's remarkable how few prehistorians have ever attempted to deal with questions like population. We're very scared of offering population numbers because they're almost totally incalculable, and you're proved wrong within a few days. But there's an interesting calculation here where he takes one of what he regards as the best archaeologically documented landscapes he can find. He could have gone to Cyril Fox's 1923 work on the archaeology of Cambridge region. He chose Sussex, largely dependent on the work of the Kirwin family, and he found an area, 9,000 acres, under prehistoric and Roman cultivation, 32 settlements, approximately 300 acres per settlement. He knew 2,500 settlements in England, therefore, by the height of the Roman period, a total area of about 750,000 acres had already been rescued from the waste. Now, that's a methodology which will be familiar to many people who struggle with things like population levels or the degree of cultivation at various times of the prehistoric and early historic past. 750,000 acres is more or less the size of the ceremonial county of Lancashire. Now, whether it made sense even in 1955, in view of what we then knew about the urban density of Britain, the major military fortifications on the frontier, could the whole of that have been supported by an agricultural zone the size of Lancashire? It seems totally implausible, but Hoskins apparently never recognised the sheer implausibility of it. But that was the best he thought he could do. The methodology is probably as near as you're going to get right. He chose the best documented area he could find. It's just that the archaeological evidence was totally inadequate. So when I say what could archaeology have told him, it may be that he didn't really see it. It could tell him very much. And then shortly afterwards came what I called here the emergence from the dark. The 1950s were a pretty dismal period in British archaeology, before a lot of things happened. I've set out here some of the major developments over the next few years. A major volume, 1960, Royal Commission's volume, Matter of Time, drawing attention to the number of monuments that were being destroyed. 65, start of excavations at Mucking, the first of what we might call the modern era of all year-round major rescue excavation. 69, the first serious motorway archaeology report, not just development sites like quarries at Mucking, but infrastructure, motorways, railways. A methodology for investigating these things was being developed. 1971, Foundation of Rescue. 1972, Christopher Taylor's classic paper emphasising the sheer rate of destruction in much of our lowland. The things surviving on the hilltops like Stonehenge or Avebury were simply those things which had escaped later ploughing, and most of our archaeological record had been destroyed by ploughing in the zone of destruction. Something that in retrospect looks obvious but needed saying and has been taken seriously ever since. 1974, an important volume by Don Benson and David Miles on the gravels of the Upper Thames, using aerial photography to show the sheer extent of now destroyed settlement in the lowlands. In other words, by the early 1970s, Prehistoric landscapes were no longer just isolated sites on hilltops, but we recognise those as marginal, outlying survivals with the densest prehistoric occupation lying in the lowlands. We were beginning to approach the idea of a prehistoric landscape. But it wasn't until 1994 that we get legislation to account for the destruction, and from 1994 then it really dates modern archaeology with the production of huge quantities of new and high quality data. Some of that was happening by the time he wrote his revised preface in 1977, and he wrote, archaeologists have added enormously to our knowledge. He is aware of archaeology, he's sympathetic, and he's beginning to realise the enormity of what's been discovered in the previous 20 years. All previous estimates are far too low. Right again. And he cites some of this classic work, in addition, Somerset Levels, Fenland Survey, and he writes it's premature to contemplate revision. He never wrote the text, a revised text, partly, I think, because he began to realise the sheer enormity of the task, not just for the medieval period, but the first two chapters would have to be completely rewritten. Since then, things have become even better documented. This is some figures recently produced by Chris Evans of the Cambridge Archaeological Unit, documenting the number of Iron Age sites known in the Cambridge region. In Cyril Fox's work of 1923, there were 4. By 2000, there were 69. By 2013, there's an estimate, not of the total number, but the density. The number of Iron Age sites predicted for the Cambridge region has gone up by a factor of 20 since 2000. How many Iron Age sites were there in the country as a whole? We simply have no idea. Last time Irons and colleagues attempted to count the number of pottery collections we had, there were well over 7,000, and that's a huge underestimate. So in the time since Hoskins was first writing, our appreciation of the density and the location of human settlement has changed out of all recognition, and we can begin to talk about landscapes rather than individual sites. So if he was writing his book now, he would have a very different archaeological base to rely on, and his judgment of archaeology might have been very different. If we're wrong then about the Saxon period as beginning the clearance, and nothing much of any significance had happened before, when else might we look? One tempting tradition would be to look to the Neolithic. The Neolithic clearances, the first episode of human clearance of the woodland to establish farming in an open environment, has been a tempting idea. The Neolithic, it's changed in its interpretation. When it first started, an idea of Lubbock, it was an idea produced by Lubbock, and his definition was based on stone tool technology. It was a technological definition, differentiating the latest material from the earlier chipped stone. John Myers emphasised something different, sedentism and pottery. Child emphasised food production. And from the 1920s onwards, really, emphasis has been very much on clearance of the landscape in order to establish farming as the critical episode in the human past, which changed the method of food supply and altered the landscape. So to quote from another famous book on the history of the countryside, this one by Oliver Rackham, there's no doubt about the sudden impact of Neolithic men. It is only men, I'm afraid. Settlers arrived, brought with them crops, animals and weeds which constitute agriculture, and immediately set about trying to convert Britain by clearing it of woodland into an imitation of the steppes. Nowadays we're not nearly so sure. Much of the discussion about the Neolithic clearance has produced evidence for earlier clearances. They weren't necessarily, there were clearances in the woodland, either deliberately or by fire, exploited by humans back into the Mesolithic. But I've been critical of Hoskins so far, but there were a couple of things he said which are really rather interesting, partly for what he said and partly for what he didn't do. With the late Bronze Age, especially the early Iron Age, further development of agriculture led to the appearance of settled villages, a revolution in human life comparable in magnitude with the effects of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. In other words, he's here recognising the importance of sedentism, settled human occupation in architecturally constructed settlement sites as the foundation of a revolution in life, which he dissociates from agriculture. It's Sedentism, which is an important thing, although he puts it here in the Late Bronze Age, especially the Early Iron Age. He doesn't really follow that up in any sense, although it seems to be in many ways a critical insight which we'll come back to. And there's another thing he says. If we clothe the landscape with the wrong kind of trees or allow in it plants and birds that are really in the product of some recent changes, then he said, we're making major mistakes. Here he's suggesting that there's a more ecological view of the plants, the birds, the animals, the wildlife and the other life forms in the landscape. It's not just historical patterns of landholding or field systems, but an ecological approach. But having suggested this, he does nothing about it. I've struggled to find any reference to birds in his book. There's a brief discussion of trees when he talks about the sycamore being introduced in the 16th century, and then obviously a discussion of hawthorn hedges in the enclosure period. But there's remarkably little else. One question he doesn't ask, because I think he thinks it's so obvious, the answer will be the Anglo-Saxon period, he just doesn't ask, when did the English landscape take on something like its current visual aspect of cleared but not totally cleared woodland, mixed agriculture of arable pastoral, with more or less the established set of trees, plants, wildlife, insects, birds, and so on. And I think we're now in a position beginning to answer that and find answers. When did the English landscape undergo the major change which shaped it irrevocably for the future? And what I want to look at some of these lines of evidence. A lot of what I'm going to say is not necessarily completely new. Some of it I'm exploiting the work of other people in recent years. But by putting everything together with some new evidence and a rather new way of emphasizing some of the information, I think we begin to reach a new vision, which has significant impact on how we look at later prehistory. The latest analysis of the radiocarbon dated woodland clearances suggests, yes, there was a phase of Neolithic clearance, but it was followed by a period of regeneration in the late Neolithic, from about 3,300 onwards. Woodlands were regenerating in many parts of England. The major final clearance started perhaps in the early Bronze Age, 2400. For a millennium, most of the landscape of England was cleared in the Bronze Age, not in the Neolithic. And in another paper published in 2012, Chris Stevens and Dorian Fuller they give it the rather provocative title, "Did Neolithic Agriculture Fail?" I'm not going to partly the idea of failing assumes that there's some sort of target or some sort of ambition it was aiming at. But the idea that Neolithic agriculture declined in the late Neolithic, along with the other evidence for woodland regeneration, now seems to be well documented. And Stevens and Fuller introduced the concept of a Bronze Age agricultural revolution. That was the time at which agriculture really took hold as the primary means of food production on a large scale throughout England, with a variety of lines of evidence, including new crops. Well, if we follow that up, there are some things which are quite clear. When does the archaeology of domestic houses start? The Middle Bronze Age, 1500-ish BC. We have very, very few houses from the earlier Bronze Age and the late Neolithic. What we're seeing from 1500 BC onwards is a tradition of post-built round houses like these Black Patch, which is then more or less continuous, with a few problems, into the early Roman period. So domestic architecture and Sedentism, 1500-ish plus or minus. Fields and land division. The earliest field divisions may go back to before 2000, but largely it's an episode, as pointed out by David Yates, Richard Bradley and others. From about 1700 we begin to see field systems in many different areas. For instance, we find them in the Dartmoor reefs, the upland coaxial systems which Hoskins either failed to see or failed to be interested in. Although if you look at the photographs on the right, it's pretty difficult not to see them once you're walking across Dartmoor. And then at their most complex, we have these very extensive coaxial field systems, like this one outlined here in red, a late Bronze Age field system about 900 BC or so underneath Terminal 5 at Heathrow, but a small part of a system which spreads over the whole of the West London gravels. If they ever did build another runway at Heathrow, we could probably write the archaeological report now. It's the most heavily documented landscape in the country. What they will find is more and more of the same. And they'll find late Bronze Age field systems all over the area. So field systems, landscape organisation, field systems, going back perhaps to before 2000, common from 17 or 1600 onwards. What about animals? Something that wild animals, something that Hoskins simply doesn't talk about, despite his emphasis on the importance of ecology. The consequence of agriculture is the elimination of the wild animals that compete with it, or the elimination of their habitat, which drives them further out. The bear, the last clearly documented bear bone from southern England, is at about 2,200 Grooveware burial in northern Hampshire. Although there are persistent stories that bears may have hung on in Scotland until about 800. There are none in southern England after about 2,200 BC. The aurochs, similarly, the wild predecessor of cattle, the native wild cattle of northern Europe, the latest we know of them is the early Bronze Age, perhaps about 1800. Wolf, very rare in later prehistoric. Although we know quite a lot of wolves, we don't actually know quite when they were driven out of southern England. The last one probably survived until about 1700 in Scotland. The lynx, the last known one, probably about 100 AD in Scotland. The larger wild animals are being progressively eliminated from southern England as their habitats are reduced by farming, by what people call the domestication of the wild landscape. The wild animals are no longer there. Well, what takes their place? Again, Hoskins points to a question which he didn't follow up. We have a number of animals which appear in the Middle Bronze Age. Most important of these is probably the hare, an animal of the open grassland, herbivorous, known from the Middle Bronze Age onwards, but not earlier. The grassland environment of a farmed pastoral landscape exists at the point when the hare colonizes. But if the hare is an animal of the farmland, there's another animal of the domestic house. Mus domesticus, adapted to cohabiting with humans, especially where humans are growing cereals and leaving cereal grains around for mice to pick up. Earliest known mouse, now Middle Bronze Age, 1400-ish BC, and present thereafter. There's an intriguing possibility, although not yet proved, that there might have been another arrival alongside the mouse, a cohabiter of mice and a predator of small rodents and small birds. So far, the earliest known cat is from the later part of the Iron Age, but there's every possibility that we'll find earlier evidence, and we'll find that Tom and Jerry came together at 1500 BC as part of the new fauna inhabiting humanly settled landscapes. And it's not just animals. Hoskins mentioned birds and never talked about them. Well, we have later prehistoric birds, again, documenting the same change in the landscape. The house sparrow, very, very rare until the Middle Bronze Age, but known from late Bronze Age sites onwards, something adapted to living in and around human settlements, and especially on the fringes of agriculture. One of the most Indicative is the starling, a bird which feeds off short-cropped grassland, cattle pastures in particular, unknown until the Middle Bronze Age, and then present in large numbers throughout prehistory. Those are probably the two dominant ones, the domestic settlement and the field systems, but there are other birds which are again occupy the arable landscape, pastoral landscape called woodland fringes, which are very rare before the Middle Bronze Age, but are common thereafter. Blackbird and so on. Blackbird, song thrush, lapwing. These are all things which colonize the new landscape. And we could do the same sort of analysis with other things like wildflowers. The wildflowers which are weeds of cultivation. They come in along with regular widespread wheat growing or barley growing. Another line we haven't got time to explore properly here is hedges. Field systems often have hedges. From the Middle Bronze Age, blackthorn becomes more common, a common hedging plant. So we begin to see a managed landscape reflected in the type of hedging. And just one more example. A wonderfully characteristic and indicative species, the dung beetle. In fact, the dung beetle is about 25 different species, but they live on dung. They prefer herbivorous dung, cattle in particular. And so the rising proportion of dung beetles in the insect fauna record is an indicator of closer proximity to more and more animals, in particular cattle. And we can document this from a very low percentage in the Neolithic through rising percentages in the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age. Unfortunately, the study of prehistoric insects, especially dung beetles, is a very specialism and is only undertaken by a few people. So the documentation is based on a few sites, but it's very good and very reliable. We just need more of them. So the detailed study of the history of the dung beetle is certainly a major project for the future. And so we come to what I would call here the mid-Bronze Age revolution. The answer to the question, when did the English landscape take on something like its mostly cleared, permanently settled, divided form with familiar trees, familiar birds, familiar animals, familiar weeds? The answer isn't the Anglo-Saxon period, isn't the Neolithic. It's somewhere around 1500 BC in the middle of the Bronze Age. Now, Stevens Fuller coined the phrase the Bronze Age agricultural revolution. I don't want really to call this the Bronze Age revolution, partly because people might think it has anything to do with bronze. It has in a way, but we'll come to that in a moment. And partly because if you call it the Bronze Age revolution, people will think it started at the beginning of the Bronze Age. It didn't. The three-age system of Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age is completely irrelevant to the understanding of the major phases of the development of the English landscape. The major change happened in the middle of the Bronze Age. With sedentism, commitment to agriculture, major ecological changes, landscape organisation, new crops, new agriculture, a complete new way of life. But now, if we think through getting away a little bit from the landscape, thinking through the consequences of the sort of society we would have inhabited that very different managed agricultural landscape, there are consequences in the way that society can react, partly to the demands of a new agricultural economy, partly to the opportunities offered by agriculture and its byproducts. And so we find a lot of new industries starting up in the immediate aftermath of the adoption of a commitment to agriculture. Firstly, textiles. We have intensive sheep rearing produces wool. So we find, as we'll see in a moment, the first clear evidence of woven woolen textiles from about 1500. Leather, the first tools you designed for leatherworking, again from about 1200. But then there are technological innovations supporting the food productive industry. Metalwork, bronze, the beginning of ironworking, salt for preservation, the technology of ovens for baking, but also pottery. And we'll look at some of these to see how the changes affect broader aspects of human culture. We find the first evidence for textile production in the form of loom weights and the smaller spindle whorls. These, not everywhere, these are possibilities taken up in some parts of southern and eastern England from about 1500 BC as people see the possibility of using wool to produce textiles, which can then be made into clothes for a world in which there had been probably linen, but maybe fibre, bark, furs, a wool which can be turned into clothing, which can then be dyed to produce patterns, can produce colour, is a completely different cultural possibility. One interesting thing is the later Bronze Age bronze working. For the earlier part of the Bronze Age, the output had been largely weapons or ceremonial objects, daggers, axes, halberds. From about 1200 or 1300 perhaps BC, we begin to find, first of all, a range of new techniques, casting, sheet metal work, but also new products. Some of them obviously symbolically, ceremonially important, like cauldrons for feasting, but in particular a whole range of tools. We haven't seen much in the way of tools before in bronze, but tool production for the agricultural economy becomes a completely new way of using bronze. And so we get things like axes, sickles, gouges, leather knives, providing better quality tools for agriculture in the form of sickles, for woodworking with gouges, drills, chisels, but also for leatherworking with leather knives. So the bronze technology is completely transformed and has impact on a range of other industrial activities using the byproduct of agriculture. But as well as bronze, we also find early ironworking. Iron begins to be experimented with from at least 1100 BC. And this again can be a response to the demand for new and better tools. In this case, so the transformation of the bronze industry and the development of the iron industry happen side by side. We're not dealing with a transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age, but we're looking with two different metal technologies being developed side by side. And so one of the great problems of how you explain the transition from a bronze industry to an iron industry at about 700 can be seen in a very different light, because it just didn't happen that way. But it did take a long time for iron technology to get to any reliable, regular, quality production. And the salt industry, something that in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, as the work of Anthony Harding, John Chapman and others has shown, salt is an important industry which develops very soon after the adoption of farming. In some way, it's important for the preservation of the food produced by major agricultural activity. And one of the problems is, why didn't we see it earlier in the Neolithic in Britain? But because agriculture was not the full-scale committed enterprise that we find from the Bronze Age. We now know the Bronze Age salt extraction activity around the coast of England by evaporation from salt water from about 1500 BC, and you find it all the way down the North Sea coast from Berwick to Dover, along the south coast, and into the Severn estuary. A major industry along the coastline, somehow, we're not quite sure yet how, used for preserving food, and characteristic material, the clays involved in production sites with pedestals and troughs for evaporation, but also higher up here, some very distinctive, very coarse pottery used as containers for distributing it inland. It clearly was a major enterprise. It starts about 1500 and it's closely related to the onset of committed agriculture. But pottery again changes. If you look at Middle Bronze Age pottery, later part of the Early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze, most of the pottery is a pretty boring range of large jars. There's very little in the way of range of forms. But after about 1200, we begin to find a much wider range. These are all Middle Bronze Age ones from Wessex. By about 1200, pottery begins to produce a much wider range of storage jars, cooking jars, smaller cups for drinking and eating. Pottery responds in a context in which the ownership of possessions is no longer a burden because you have to move, but once you're permanently settled, possessions become a benefit rather than a problem. And pottery proliferates into a variety of forms. No, don't really want to bore people with too many pottery profiles. So to go back, a lot of what I'm saying has been done by other people quite recently, but putting it all together, I think, emphasises the importance of the episode around 1500 BC. And looking back through the literature, Gordon Childe, in his Prehistoric Communities of the British Isles, got some of it right, or some of it almost right. He obviously didn't have the benefit of modern dating techniques, but he used the word revolution in at least 2 cases after, not his famous Neolithic revolution, but 2 later revolutions. He talked about the abortive industrial revolution of the late Bronze Age, where he drew attention to these changes in the technology, but also the outputs of industry, but related it to a new organisation with democratic control over the materials and the wresting of control of the bronze industry from an elite to the proletariat. And he also talked about the agricultural revolution, which he didn't associate with the metalworking revolution. And he also got the date completely wrong because at that point, in the 1940s, nobody knew the true chronology of the later Bronze Age. But he emphasised plough agriculture, fields. He emphasised secondary industries such as textiles. But he misdated it to about 600 BC, which he thought then was the late Bronze Age. And he attributed it to waves of migrants, as one would have done in the 1940s, but wouldn't do any more. But somehow or other, the germ, the ideas of what I've been talking about are there, wrongly dated, lack of information, misinterpreted, misexplained, but somehow their importance recognised. And so we could go back to Hoskins and say, did he almost get it right? Going back to that same quotation I showed you earlier, if you simply correct his date and rewrite his sentence as, with the Middle Bronze Age, further developed agriculture, that's a pretty good sentence. We might quibble about the use of, if I was marking this in a student essay, we would quibble about the use of the settled villages. Village is awfully medieval, but that Hoskins was a medievalist. But the idea of the revolution in human life comparable with the effects of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century is certainly is something that many of us might agree was a pretty fair description of what was happening, a major change in the way in which people inhabited and related to their landscape, comparable to the changes of the 19th century, and starting really a period from the Middle Bronze Age to the Industrial Revolution, which one can see as more or less continuous whole, despite the historic disruptions of the Roman conquest and the Anglo-Saxon, or the Anglo-Saxon invasion, arrival, or non-invasion and non-arrival, depending on who you believe about what actually happened in the 5th century AD. And that's another message, really. The increasing irrelevance of some of the time frameworks. I said earlier on that the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, 3-age system no longer really indicates the major changes. It also leads people to think more about technology driving social change or being a critical part of it rather than responding to the social needs of the community. And it's very interesting, some other projects going on at the moment. Some of you may have seen recent work by Stephen Rippon, The Fields of Britannia, where he's arguing that Anglo-Saxon settlement patterns owe a considerable amount to the pre-existing Roman pattern of the pattern of density of settlement and the nature of the settlement. There is no major disruption in much of the pattern of occupation of Britain between the Roman and the Saxon period. Another project being done in Reading has been looked at the impact of recent archaeological work on the Roman period. Already published their volume on its effect on urban life in Roman Britain. There's similar work being done on rural Roman Britain. And one of the things they're beginning to recognise is the continuity between early Roman and late Iron Age, to the point where something like 80% of early Roman sites were in fact founded in the late Iron Age. The conquest does not represent a major hiatus. If you're looking for some sort of reorganisation of the Roman landscape, it's more likely to be around 250 AD than it is around AD 43. So these major historical or technological divisions are increasingly being broken down as we look for other ways of looking for the major changes in the pattern of human occupation of the landscape. And so, I come back to my sort of starting point of Hoskins, and I still find his last chapter really rather, as I say, a modernist whinge. I can begin to understand why he wrote what he did about prehistory. I think it's still partly the fault of archaeology at its state in the 1950s, and it really did not have that much to tell him. But it does now, and anybody who tries to write the sort of Hoskins book nowadays, rather than 1955, would have to write a very different 2 or 3 opening chapters. But I think the key episode would be what happened in and around 1500 BC, as I've been trying to explain. Thank you very much for listening.